Hi, welcome to GCSE Poetry Lesson 12 on Carol Ann Duffy. What we're going to look at today is how poetry, and the poet here, explores the political and how art can... Well, actually, it's more of a question. Can art actually raise emotions in the reader and make them act differently and to change anything? Or is art simply something to spectate or to reflect what's going on? That's something that the poem War Photographer really wrestles with. In this booklet that I made for you, on page 47, there is another one of her poems, which is in the other cluster, the Love and Relationships cluster, called Before You Were Mine. And I would like you to read through that poem on your own and practice your unseen skills doing it, because the lesson's only going to look at the studied poem, but of course you need to practice with all the poems in the anthology, and you have to read as many poems as possible. Also, when you read a few of Carol Ann Duffy's poems, you'll understand her style more. So please remember to look at and study that and just respond to that poem. Okay, so let's start. Here are a bunch of images. This is before the coronavirus, so we might have, of course, put that one as the #1 international kind of issue going on. But these are a bunch of images from different conflicts around the world. I want you to just pause and talk to your partner or write down in your book, which of these conflicts are you aware of around the world? And what do you feel your responsibility as a citizen of the UK? What is your responsibility in these circumstances to help? Does it change your responsibility when the government, when I say we, I mean the government in our name, when we support the aggressor? And in what ways do we, as British citizens, have a responsibility to stop suffering? These are big questions. These are not things I would expect you to answer in a simple way, and I'm not going to necessarily tell you what it is that you should be feeling, but I'd like you to be able to think about and be able to reflect on how you feel yourself about these things, because that's going to help you get a foothold and access to this poem in a bigger way. There is an artist who I really like called Ai Weiwei, a Chinese artist, and he makes art that is very directed towards the politics of the time. So in the middle image there, he covers the pillars of this, I think it was in Berlin. I don't know the building itself. Oh, it's the Kunsthaus. I think it's the Modern Art Museum. He covered the pillars with 14,000 refugee jackets. He's taking a selfie with the phrase "no one is illegal." The image on the left and the bottom, he fills New York galleries with thousands of garments gathered from refugee camps. And he's made a movie, an amazing movie, whose name is escaping me right now. Human Trap, no, it'll come to me in a second. But if you look him up, he's got an amazing movie about refugees all over the world. And what these pieces of art are trying to do is trying to bring attention to something that's happening all over the world and that maybe we don't think about. Certainly in Europe, we try to imagine it's not happening, and he finds it outrageous, and he wants to really bring attention to it. So I just want you to think about what do you know about these images? What do you make of this as an art statement? Here's something else he did, which I really, really love. He went around the world giving the middle finger to different monuments and political capitals. So here he's giving the finger to the White House, the Eiffel Tower, and Tiananmen Square in China. I want you to pause and just think for a sec. Just look at these hilarious. I just think they're absolutely hilarious, and quite, and in their own way, really powerful images. What's the message here? What is it meant to represent or say? Is this childish? And if it is childish, is that still a valid artistic expression? I mean, for me, they're valid because they're actually expressing anger, and they are individual, and they're not necessarily beautiful aesthetic objects, but they do express something and a sense of perspective in a really precise way that I think really gets to something that inside of me about anger and being fed up and being powerless, and what art is as an expression of that powerlessness, but also that outrage. I don't know if you're familiar with this image, and you can look there about what is actually going on. I think their medals were taken away from them because you're not allowed to have any sort of political expression during the Olympics. These two American athletes expressing their complete solidarity with the Black Civil Rights Movement in America. I want you to think about these two statements and position yourself somewhere in it and take position to justify your answer. Okay, so on one side, art is about political issues. Art about political issues does nothing. Art is only for the rich and the powerful. Art is another form of entertainment. It changes nothing. On the other end, art is an expression of personality and individuality. Through beauty, anger, and sometimes shock and excitement, you can awaken the viewer an awareness of the injustice and inequality in the world and can change things. Could you pause this video and place yourself on this line? And you might want to look at the image on the left. I mean, it is sports, but in a way, the photograph might be an expression of art, or maybe even their action could be interpreted in this way. But I just want you to pause and position yourself. Where do you personally feel? Is art something that's just like entertainment? It's no different. Or does art actually have the possibility of changing? And if you could just justify your position. Okay, so what you've started to do is think about these big issues at play for Duffy. In this poem, what she's trying to deal with is, what is art trying to do? What is in her poem a photographer, but in a kind of higher way, her own poem, what is it actually trying to say or do about injustice in the world? And we're going to once again try to respond to the poem using our techniques of unseen poetry, to try and deal with the poem and respond to it, and then do a journal response. Okay, so the poem is called War Photographer. I want you to just look at these images and write a word or sentence. What do you see in these photographs, and what will this poem be about? Okay, if you could just pause the video and predict. It's a prediction, of course. Okay, so what we're going to be looking at in this poem is someone who takes photographs during war for journalism, to inform the world. And what's interesting about, we've looked at paintings and images throughout these poetry lessons, but what I want you to think about is these images. What do images say? How do they speak? Is the photographer a witness, or are they trying to stop or change something? What does the photographer feel? Can you tell from the image? Does the image give us a clue? These are questions about photography that I think are fascinating, which is to say, is the photographer simply witnessing, or the way they frame and present, is it giving us an idea? Is, for example, the photographer of the boy with the flower and putting it against the gun, is the way the photograph is essentially presented showing us that he sympathizes with the young boy, or sees the young boy, the flower, in contrast to the bayonet, as clearly towards one side? Is this man holding a child seemingly covered in blood is outside of the context of the conflict? Are we necessarily obliged to feel sympathy for that person, for that situation? The image on the bottom left gives us no context, no understanding. It shows me just the confusion, the fragility of war. Eggs going up makes me think of something comic, but also something in this context quite violent, as those eggs are smashing open. It helps me see nothing. I don't know who the good guy is. I don't know who the bad guy is. Photography can do all those things. It can do a range of different things. And reading an image is something like it's not dissimilar to reading a poem. You got to figure out what the image is trying to do, and then you can interpret it in your own way. So remember what we do for photographers on page 48. I'd like you to take a look at it. I'd like you to read it at least 2 times before you do the reading with me. So if you want to pause right now, you can do that. On your multiple readings, I would like you to notice places, the imagery of photography, what the photographer sees, what can you see when reading, and the final lines. Those are all things I want you to notice. So if you want to pause right now and start that reading. Okay. I'm just trying to think, should I give you the structure? Well, you've read the poem yourself now a few times. So I'm just going to give you the general structure of the poem. It's a record of places and suffering in the first stanza. In the second stanza, the photographer comes back to England and is developing the photographs they've made, which is an old technique. Now it's funny to think about because you're also used to digital photography. Cameras used to be printed on film, and you used to not know what you had on film until you went back into the dark room to develop it. Then he has a memory, or she has a memory of asking, almost taking permission to take an image of someone dying. And then in the end realizes there's a meaninglessness to these moments in the newspaper, and nobody actually cares, and this kind of traumatizes the poor photographer. So if you've read the poem a few times, that structure should help you start to break down what the poem's about. If you're reading, what I'd like you to do if you're reading is to read the poem again, and you could look really closely at the language that Duffy uses to explore the photographer's feelings. He wants us, the readers, the viewers, to feel something. And she wants us as readers of her poem to feel something. And strangely, he uses people suffering in a certain way, and you might notice how she does that as well. And so I'm reading a little bit against the poem here. I'm reading with and against it in the end, which is to say, how do these people almost exploit what's happening in these situations that they're describing, and how might that be a negative thing? So let me start and try and read this poem with you here. In his it is a he. In his dark room, he is finally alone, with spools of suffering set out in ordered rows. That's an image of film. Film used to come in these canisters, and they're spools. So the image is of all these suffering is invisible and on this in these things, and it's ordered or organized suffering, which is kind of a weird way of thinking about it. The only light is red because in a dark room the light is red, so you don't expose the camera, the film, and softly glows as though this were a church, and he a priest preparing to intone a mass. So here he is compared to a priest. This is a religious ceremony. And the place names are prayers. Belfast in Northern Ireland, Beirut in Lebanon, Phnom Penh in Cambodia, and a line from the Christian Bible, all flesh is grass, temporary, ready to be mowed down. He has a job to do. Solution slops and trays beneath his hands, which do not tremble then, though seem to now. He's home, he's in rural England, home again, to ordinary pain which simple weather can dispel, to fields which don't explode beneath the feet of running children in a nightmare heat. So, home isn't a nightmare. However, the memory and the negative description is striking. Explode under the feet, nightmare. Nightmare is the word, really. That's this horrible situation of place is really where he isn't. He's far away from the nightmare, but he still has this, I'd almost say, trauma of this experience. Something's happening. So is the photograph developing? Or is the memory or photo? We don't know. A stranger's features faintly start to twist before his eyes, a half-formed ghost. He remembers, here comes the memory and trauma again, the cries of this man's wife, how he sought approval without words to do what someone must, and how the blood stained into foreign dust. I mean, I don't like her rhymes very much. I find them very heavy, but there they are. Okay, so what is the duty here? Duty seems to be something that really emerges in these different poems. Is the duty to bear witness, to see, to tell, to narrate, to record? We don't know. But he's dead, and it's foreign because he's not in England. So, I mean, for the man dying, he's not in foreign dust. But what the photographer remembers is the blood staining on the foreign dust. And this has caused him some kind of trauma, and he's reliving it as he's developing his photograph. 100 agonies in black and white, from which his editor will pick out 5 or 6 for Sunday's supplement. The reader's eyeballs prick with tears between the bath and the pre-lunch beers. Tears, beers is a mocking rhyme. Prick, that tiny dot, is, again, it's sarcasm. Because there's 100 agonies, so much suffering. But the editor will just pick 5 or 6 only. Reduce this whole suffering into 5 or 6 moments, and all they will do is prick, as in a little dot of tear, between the bath and before lunch, having a beer on a Sunday probably. And here we see his feeling like this is meaningless. No one cares. They're indifferent. To be a photojournalist isn't changing anything, seemingly. And the final lines, the photographer's back seemingly on a plane, and he stares now impassively at where he earns his living, and I never noticed that, they don't care. Is it they? He stares impassively at where he earns his living, so this is a job. And they do not care, and stares. So is it the people? Or is it possibly even his own eyes? I don't know. Because it's the impassively. Like, so he stares impassively at where he earns. He seems to be completely disengaged and traumatized, and can't really deal with this fact of what he's witnessing and participating in almost, and the fact that it's coming to nothing. And, you know, he got that approval without words, presumably a way of saying, I will bear witness to this, I will show people what's happening, but really nobody cares. So all of this is a way of saying, so what is the job of the war photographer? What is the job of the artist, though, is the bigger question. Remember, when we rise out of just the simple what story of the poem, we go into the bigger themes. You know, we saw this in Ozymandias, but we can see this in a number of the poems, that the literal meaning is only on one level, that there's another meaning above. So beyond the war photographer's job, think of the poet herself. Has she raised your awareness about these places at all? Are you shocked? Are you going to change the way you behave? I mean, I don't know. I'm a little bit suspicious. Is he, the photographer, using these people? Is she using these people? I think it's something I want you to at least consider. So, if you could pause this video for a moment and do your journal writing, which is I'd like you to look at for 5 to 7 minutes. I want you to consider this question. Does art and poetry help reflect and change suffering? Or do poets and artists use the suffering of others for their own benefit? Or both? Or neither? If you're not comfortable answering that question, you can do whatever it is that draws you to the poem. Something personal. It's good you use quotations from the poem. It's good that you also find a way of not using quotations and just exploring what you're thinking. And if you can ground your observations with evidence, great. You don't have to analyze the language. If you're ready to do that, great. Hopefully you should feel comfortable enough to do this at this point. So if you could just pause now for 5 to 7 minutes. Okay, so you've read one of Duffy's poems for homework. What is this called? Sorry, I'll just show you. Before You Were Mine on page 47. And we've looked at War Photographer, and you've done your journal writing and you read the poem. It's a pretty easily accessible poem. I just want to end by having you think about some issues. How does Duffy use world tragedy? Does she exploit it? How does she use it to raise awareness? How is this poem different to Before You Were Mine? So now you have these two poems, one in the love section, and here one in the conflict section. So how are these poems different? How aware are you of the world conflicts now that we're all within this coronavirus context? Beyond the international aspect of that, how aware are you of what's going on in the world? And does art help raise awareness, or does it help conceal that? And I want to take you back to that original question I asked you. As British citizens, should we compare about some conflicts more than others? And again, I'm not going to answer that for you. But what you might think about, again, is imperialism, is the relationship our government has with other governments, and the aid we give them. Are there conflicts that we as citizens should be even more interested in because our government is connected to those governments? That's something I'd like you to think about. I'm going to put a link to Duffy's, to my deeper annotations of War Photographer, and so you can do more work there. Hopefully you'll read the other poem as a piece of homework. And now we're coming towards the end of this these lessons, and what I'm going to encourage you to do with the final poems, Garland's Kamikaze and Rumin's Emigre, is treat them as unseen poems and trying to teach those poems to yourself. And then we will then you will refine and pick the poem you want to transform into a creative piece of writing the most, and that will be the end of the creative writing portion of this for year 9s. Those of you who are doing this with us under this situation, that's what you'll be doing. But year 10s, you'll be continuing and going on to the context, and then the analytic writing, and then of course the comparative writing as well. So I hope that these lessons are supporting you. I hope you're safe and well, and I hope you're learning, and I hope to talk to you soon. Thanks.